guys, welcome to video number 5 in this series where I'm going to show you a very simple but effective way of working with two types of materials and how to blend them inside Substance 3D Paint. Let's go ahead and jump straight in. All right, so in this video, I'm going to start covering some of the cool things that you would expect in a software like 3D Painter, where you can just blend a bunch of different layers and different effects and materials to create a much more complex texture. So obviously, what you can see here is a bit of a jump between what we had before and this, but don't worry, I'm going to cover kind of like a breakdown of how I did all of this. But you see that in terms of the colors and the blockout that we created in previous videos, this is exactly the same thing. The main difference is that I just spent a bit more time working on the the wear and tear, the scratches. I still think that this amount of scratches is too much, but this is getting us closer to something a bit more realistic and more interesting than what we had before. But for the most part, it's exactly the same thing. It just has a bit more wear and tear and more variation in the color and in the roughness and some of the high details as well. So you see, I just changed also that the nice panel that we created before. So I think it makes more sense to have it around here. I also had one simple line going through here. So I just simplify things a little bit because in general, I like the design that I had. I just wanted to give you those additional tools to create details. All right, so the focus of this video would be to create a variation or a transition between two materials in the same object. So the clearest example in this case would be something like this, like the tank, like the plasma tank or whatever this is, because we have something that is metallic, really shiny, that has been, probably oxidated or exposed too much to water or like water retention around these areas, and it has some rust going on, right? So this is exactly the same mesh, right? But we have two different materials going, one that is the clean metal and another one that is the rust. So I'm going to show you a very simple but very effective material setup that allows you to create this type of blending of materials in any material that you want. So again, this might look like a very basic stuff, but once you get the hang of it, it's going to simplify your workflow and keep things very simple, but at the same time, really, really powerful for super complex textures. So let's go ahead and start by the setup. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder Rust, just because I'm going to try to replicate something like this. So Rust, and let's do another folder, and let's call this folder Metal. All right, let's put this. It doesn't matter the order. We can just play around with that. For the rust, I'm gonna give it a orange color, and for the metal, I'm gonna give it a blue color so that we know which ones we're talking about. Now, what I have here already is rather complex in terms of the amount of layers that I use. So if I open metal, I actually use some custom metal that I have created before. So these are like smart materials that I created for myself before. So I'm just using a bit of that, but we're gonna essentially replicate that. So in the metal material, I'm gonna go ahead and click on a fill layer, and I'm gonna call this one metal base. And I'll do the same thing for the rust, but this time I'm just gonna duplicate the same layer. So I'm gonna hold the Alt key, drag and drop that into the rust, and I'm gonna call this one rust base. All right, now for the time being, I'm gonna turn off rust, and I'm just gonna work on the metal. So this is the initial setup done, as in you only need to have two folders that represent each of the two materials that you wanna blend. And of course, you can expand this workflow to be absolutely anything that you want, and you can have 3 materials, 4 materials, whatever you want, but we're going to keep things simple. So in the metal, I'm going to select the base metal. I'm going to go to properties, and of course, I'm going to enable the things that I want this metal to be. So with the color, I'm going to try to replicate, like I said, something like the plasma tank. Doesn't really matter. We can change this later. So I'm going to go for a greenish metal, maybe something more yellowish like that. I'm going to enable metal, and I'm going to make it full metallic, so it's nice and shiny. The rough, I'm going to also enable rough. And that way, you see, when I enable rough, it sort of like changes things quite a bit because it is essentially overriding the roughness from the previous things that I have set up. I can do that, or just for the sake of demo, I can turn everything off and you'll see the same effect. But I'm going to enable rough so that I can control how rough this metal is, right? That's pretty much all I need from this layer. So this is my base metal. At any point, come back and change the color and say, you know what? I don't want to do anything with like a green color. Let's just keep it simple, right? So you can totally do that. That's totally fine. But that's it, right? And what I like to do is I like to combine different layers with different effects so that I know each layer contributes to a specific thing. So the next thing I want to do is variate the roughness of the metal so that it's not all the same. So of course I can take my slider and make it like really shiny, and I can make it really rough, right? I can play around with that, but that is just like the general base layer. That's what I call it, the base metal. So what I can do now is create another layer, and I can name this layer rough CTRL, as in control. And this one is going to only have rough. So I'm going to enable rough and toggle off the color. So basically, this layer, if I play with the rough, I can do exactly the same thing that I was doing before, right? Now, the cool thing is that we can variate it. In fact, let's go ahead and let's remove the control, because it's not really a control. It's more like a variation. So just, I'm going to call it var, as in variation. The control is actually within the base. We can control things generally from the roughness here. All right, so with this, I'm going to create another black mask. I'm going to click on fill layer, right? And by default, this fill layer, what it's going to do is going to set the grayscale to 0.5, right? So I can take this and make it really, really shiny, but you see it is not making it like mirror-like, because we are now using a fill layer that is set to 50%. If this is too confusing, don't worry about it. In fact, you can ignore it completely. I'm just going to show you that you can take this fill layer and you can control the influence of that mask. So ultimately, we're going to build a mask in here. So I'm going to hold the Alt key to access that mask, and you see this is what I was trying to explain before, that the fill layer just gives you by default a grayscale right in the middle, right, 0.5. But we can replace this grayscale with anything that we want. We can click here and select anything in there, or we can just go to the library, just like we used to find the scratches before. We can type something like grunge, and there's a bunch of grunge maps that come with Painter. So I'm gonna go for something, let's find something with not too much contrast, but enough to create variation. So maybe something like this leak or grunge leak daddy. I'm gonna drag and drop that in there, and you see it immediately, it is mapped around the entire object. I'm gonna go ahead and tile this a little bit so it gets more resolution. And then we can play with the balance and the contrast. Now, ultimately, what we're gonna do is anything that is white or lighter values, that's where we're gonna be able to see through of this layer. So let's go back to this layer. Just again, for the sake of understanding what we are doing, I'm gonna enable color, and I'm gonna make a red color. So you see the areas in the mask that are white, those are the ones that are coming through. So these white areas. So now I can go back in here, select the grunge leaks, and I can play with the balance. So you can really see what is happening. We can also add a bit more contrast, maybe add more balance, more contrast, so that all I'm trying to do here is to generate some variation in the roughness. I'm gonna also change the tiling so we have a bit more going on, right? And now that I can see what is happening with this variation of that roughness, I'm gonna toggle off the color. I don't need that anymore. And now I can play with the roughness. So I have some areas that are a bit rougher, or it could be a bit shinier like that. That is not perfect, right? And just like this, we can go from something that looks pretty standard, I would say boring, to something that, even though it is very subtle, it looks a lot more interesting, and it has a little bit more damage than, or more wear and tear. So like it's a gun that is being used for a while, right? And all we have is just a couple of fill layers, and one of them, it has a mask. That's it. So again, I'm going to keep things very, very simple. You can make things a lot more complex. I'll cover that in another video. But in this case, we just need two things just to make it more interesting. And now, just for the sake of making something a bit better, I'm going to remove the color and just make something like this, kind of like a nickel color or something. And that's it. That's my metal. All right. So now the rust, I'm going to enable the rust. Again, this enable metal and roughness, that sort of thing, so that it basically overrides whatever is underneath. And in the rust, I'm going to play with a little bit of color. So I'm going to make it a kind of like an orange thing, right? And because it is meant to be rust, I'm going to push the roughness quite a bit. There we go. And what I like to do now, again, is control things with a different layer. So I'm going to create another one. In fact, let's delete that. I'm going to duplicate this by holding the Alt key and drag it on top. So it is exactly the same thing. And all I'm going to do is variate the color a bit. So it's going to be maybe more reddish or more yellowish and darker, like so. And I'm also going to add a little bit of hide information, and I'm going to add a black mask. All right, and then let's do a fill layer. So now this is basically what we did with the metal. The difference is that we're going to add some hide information, and we're going to play with the color as well. So instead of using the grunge, I'm going to go for noise. I'm going to type noise, and let's find some noise patterns. Something. Let's try this one. See how we go. Drop it in there, and let's increase the tiling. Maybe this is not going to work. Let's try something more noisy like this, like concrete. Yeah. All right. So this is going to look a little bit better. So you see that already, because there is a variation in color, you get this really interesting variation. So if I click on the actual layer and I push the hide down or up, it's just going to add this rusty sort of effect straight away. And then we can play around with the color again. We can make it a bit darker or more saturated, like so. The roughness, I think, is going to stay the same. And then you can go ahead and duplicate this one more time. So Alt duplicate, and it's going to obviously duplicate not only the layer and the properties that we just changed, but also the generator that has the grunge. But this time I'm just going to change the grunge to something else. Maybe let's try this grunge map that has like larger pieces. And let's go ahead and change, maybe this is a little too much, but let's go ahead and change this to a darker reddish tone like that. All right. And let's play around with the scaling of this. So tiling, let's increase the balance. I don't think this is going to work. Actually, let's find something a bit more noisy. We're just making rust anyway. So let's drop this in there. There we go. Add more balance and more contrast like so. And maybe we can reduce the tiling a bit. I think this is a little bit brushy. So I want to find something, maybe grunge rock. There we go. So this is better. So you see, just because of the non-destructive nature of things, of how we set things up, basically, we can just drag and drop different things and play around with the variation. So I think this works a little bit better for a rust. And this rust material is made out of like 3 layers. And that's it. That's the whole setup. Obviously, you can spend more time tweaking these. Maybe there's a lot of difference between that sort of reddish tone and the orange. So you go back to your base layer and then you just make it a bit, desaturated, things like that. So you can always come back and change things on the fly. But the general setup is done. So we now have the metal and then we have the rust. That's all we need in order to combine these two materials. So again, metal and rust. Now with these two materials, what I like to do is on the metal or the rust, it doesn't really matter. You can create the mask. So if I use it in the rust, I'm going to click on black mask, create a black mask, and that way hides all the rust. And from the magic wand, I'm going to click here and add a generator. So this generator is currently empty. All we need to do is click here, and we're going to use one that is especially for this type of effect, which is the dripping rust. So if I click dripping rust, straight away you'll see what is happening, right? So we can control the spreading of the rust. We can create, add more contrast to that. We can increase the spreading smoothness of it. So you want something a bit more, a bit smoother, obviously, as the name says. So it is very self-explanatory. I'm going to increase the drip intensity. So it's kind of like the water, where the water drips, that's kind of like how it's being created, that rust on this metal. So you can play around with all of that, and it's just going to use some of the curvature, the ambient occlusion, and the position map that were baked during the baking process. So that is how easy this is, right? And it doesn't have to be just one generator. You can add more. So for example, if you want to add more rust to, let's say, the crevices, right? Because, if you look at this area in here, this is a crevice, and it, in a real world, it will potentially hold more water, or it's going to be harder to dry, and that's where the rust happens. So you can add to it. So you can click on a magic wand, you can click on add generator. This time I'm going to use something like dirt or curvature. In fact, the curvature will be pretty easy, but I think the dirt does the same things. So it targets those crevices. Let's go ahead and invert that. Actually, this is not going to work because this is just, let's actually use the curvature. There we go. So now it is, we can play with the balance and target that curvature. Let's invert that. Yeah, I think this is the one. All right, so we're gonna go for this, right? So I'm just changing the global balance, and then we can blur things a tiny bit, like so. Maybe add a bit more contrast. And of course, if we expand the curvature, we can play with the sharpness of the edges. We can change how soft things are. So there's a lot of control. I'm just showing this as an extra step, but it doesn't have to be like that. Right? So obviously, when I added the curvature, you see the dripping rust just goes away. That is because I'm overriding the effect. So if I hold the Alt key and open the mask, you see now this is the rust mask, and then I'm just using the curvature on top. Now, fortunately, you can blend these effects, these black and white effects, with the blending modes here. So if I click on this one and let's say click overlay, now I'm just taking that curvature and I'm just literally overlaying it in certain areas, right? So that could be something that you want to do. Let's say this is before and there is after, so it's a lot sharper in these areas. Or we go back to the mask, I can set this to multiply, right? And it's just multiplying that curvature on top of the rust. So in a way, it's kind of like removing some of the rust and restricting it to the curvature area. So I think I'm going to go for screen. That's the one that basically adds to it. So it's a lot of rust happening, right? But that's okay. It's not subtle at all. And I always say that when it comes to texturing, it's all about the subtlety. But the cool thing is that this is the setup done. We can just go back to the curvature and reduce that sort of global reach. We can play with the medium and then go back to the dripping rust and then change the spreadingness. So this is a setup that works really well just to get started with something, and then you can come back because it is non-destructive and adjust it. All right. So hopefully this makes sense. It is a pretty simple setup, and this is a bit too intense compared to what I have in the tank, for example. But I'll just show you that if I enable tank, this is pretty much what I have in here. So I just have the rust in this single layer. So I didn't create the entire folder because I already had a material that was rust. So I didn't need to create the material, but it's essentially that. That is the entire setup. And now I'm going to show you something else that is pretty cool. Let's go ahead and wait until all the textures are compiled. And let's enable our metal and our rust. And I'm going to take these two folders and I'm going to create a single folder. So I'm going to hold Control and G, and I'm going to call this one metal rust. There we go. Give it a, I don't know, green color. And because we already set up our project and we divided things in the way that we wanted to, we can decide, okay, where do we want to put this metal rust? So what is going to be metallic and you know, rust metallic? So maybe the handle. So that is the metal. So I'm going to open this folder and I'm going to drag and drop that in there. So the entire folder. So now that metal rust is restricted to only these areas. And now that gives us a much better understanding of, you know, maybe this rust is way too much for this type of asset, and not everything is as dirty or as old. It's not like a blaster gun that is being left in the sand and in the environment or in the elements rusting away. Because there's going to be a lot of contrast between that and the cleaner plastics, right? So we can go back, open up the rust, and maybe go into the mask and play around with the dripping of the rust. So I'm going to reduce that so that is less, reduce the contrast as well, maybe go to the curvature, add a little bit more of that. So, you know, this is exactly what I was saying, that once you have the setup completed, because it is non-destructive, you can come back and adjust it and say, all right, this is more like, this is something that works a lot better for the rest of the textures that I'm creating. But the setup is super simple, right? One folder per each material, and then you use a mask to blend those two materials. And then because we already have things split into folders or sections, just drag and drop it in there and adjust it. So very, very simple stuff, but I think very effective as well. All right, so that's it for this video. And in the next one, we're going to create something a bit more complex for something like the plastic material. I'll see you there.